Uh-oh. All right, very good morning this morning to everybody. Glad you joined us here at Market Street Church of Christ. Good to see each and every one of you. We've got a few visitors as well. This particular class is the study of the life of Jesus Christ, the chronological study of the life of Christ. We've been going through this study for a few years and still continuing through it. We're in no rush. And so we're just taking verse by verse looks at various events of the life of Christ. And so if you want to open your Bibles to Luke chapter 16, that's where we're going to be. Luke chapter 16. I guess I didn't load the.
What's the heading on?
It should be Bible study, Life of Christ, I think 150 to 164, something like that. It might not have made it on there. If you'll just put in the Life of Christ, I think it goes up to about 164. If not, it's okay. Well, look at there. All right. So as we've explained in the past, if you go to our website, you can get this list, this Harmony of the Gospel accounts. And you'll see here where we're going through this various events. And right now we've been in the book of Luke. We are going now to Luke chapter 16. That'll be number 162 there on that list. Jesus tells the parable of the unfaithful steward. And then we'll keep working our way through that. So Luke chapter 16 is where we're at. And we'll explain a little bit more. Let me get on caught up here to where we talked about these are all relative as far as context. When we talk about, in fact, let's back up real quick. Look in chapter 15, verse 1. That's where we'll start, and then we'll go into chapter 16. Chapter 15, verse 1 is your context so that you understand what we're talking about, what's going on, who he's talking to, and things like that. Verse 1, then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. Well, from that point, he goes into three different parables. That parable of the lost sheep. He then goes into the parable of the lost coin. And then the third parable, which is the prodigal son. So that's your context of what's going on here as we now go into Luke chapter 16, verses 1 through 18. And notice what it says there beginning. It says, and he also said to his disciples. So what he's done is those first three parables, he kind of directed them directly to the Pharisees. Talking to everybody, but kind of directing those more to the Pharisees. He now turns and he's talking to his disciples. But it's no different than if I'm sitting here talking to Joey, right? And I'm going to tell Joey a story about Steve, right? Steve's sitting right here. Steve's still in the room, right? So they're hearing everything, right? That's what he's doing. He's talking to his disciples, but the Pharisees are right there listening. So they see the implication, and you'll see at the end of this, they certainly pick up the implication of this parable. So let's read this now fourth parable that Jesus gives us. In chapter 16. And he said to his disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward, and an accusation was brought to him that this man was wasting his goods. So he called him and said to him, what is this I hear about you? Give an account on your stewardship, for you can no longer be steward. Then the steward said within himself, what shall I do? For my master is taking the stewardship away from me. I cannot dig. And I'm ashamed to beg. I have resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his master's debtors to him and said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, how much do you owe? So he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said to him, take your bill and write 80. So the master commended the unjust steward because he had dealt shrewdly. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. And I say to you, make friends for yourself by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, they may receive you into everlasting habitations. He who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, you will commit to your trust, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in what is another man's, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Now look at verse 14. Now the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, also heard these things, and they derided him. All right, so that's what I was saying a minute ago. He's talking to his disciples, but it's like me talking to Joey with Steve right here, knowing that what I'm talking about, it's for their benefit, but it's so they can also hear what's going on. All right, now, this parable is probably one of the most misunderstood and misapplied parables that I hear often. People often ask me what this parable means, or they don't understand what it means. It falls, in my opinion, in the same category as what people get confused about Rahab. You know, Rahab, you remember that story, who Rahab is? Who can tell me who Rahab is? Let's test your Bible knowledge. Jericho. In one word, Jericho. Perfect. She's the harlot in Jericho who harbored or hid. Very good, Joey. She saved the spies. And there's the point. She lied, and a lot of people get confused whenever you go to Hebrews chapter 11, and it says she's commended. But read the words carefully. She's commended for her faith, not the lying. Now there's the big difference right there. Keep that in mind as you look at this parable now, okay? So think of that the way you look at Rahab. She's commended for her faith, not the lying. Now let's look at this unjust steward. So we see here, to understand the context, as we just said, going back to chapter 15. And so what we saw in chapter 15 was God's initiative. God making the initiative with going out with the 99, leaving the 99, going to the one. That's God's initiative in saving his own. This now in chapter 16, both of these are going to be man's initiative, what we do in order to get into heaven. And so it goes, once again, talking about the Pharisee. So you have this wealthy man who has a steward. This is where we get our word stewardship, whenever we're talking about stewardship. And that, who can tell me what stewardship means? A simple definition. What's that? No?
You're in charge of your master's wealth.
Taking care of somebody else's stuff, right? You've been put in charge of somebody else's possessions or goods or something like that. So this steward, all right, is somebody, this is not some light position that he has. His master, this wealthy man, has put all of that in this person's hands. And so it's a very serious responsibility, highly trusted position, which apparently he abused. Doesn't say what he did, doesn't say how he got into trouble with his master, but the fact of the matter is he did something. The master's not happy. As it says here that he said, what is this I hear about you? All right, he was wasting his goods is how it says. So we don't know exactly what that means by wasting it. Was he taking it for himself? Was he not keeping good books, or what was going on there? But he was doing something wrong, wasting his goods, so he has to give an account. That's the thing about stewardship. If it belongs to somebody else, you have to give an account for that. Be held accountable. Boy, that's a lesson we need in today's society. There's so many people now that don't want to take responsibility for their actions, don't want to be held accountable, or they want to shirk that accountability one way or the other, or put it off on somebody else. this is a great lesson in showing you've got to deal with your own issues, your own accountability here. So gives an account. Now, this kind of steward is not somebody you just fire and get rid of. There's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out, right? This guy's got a lot of material, a lot of things. He's got to reconcile the accounts, get the books together, get everything so he can turn it over to his master. Does that make sense? So this is a very involved position. So this is part of the lesson in this small window of time. All right, in this small window of time of going from being the steward who had full access to his master's goods and everything and was in control of them, he's being fired. He's got this small window of basically what we would say you need to clean out your desk, right? Does that make sense? That's in today's society. Go clean out your desk and bring me all the paperwork and we got to close all this out. So there's that window, and then whenever he has nothing, he's no longer employed, and what does he say? He has no real skills, right? What does he say? He says, I cannot dig, all right? So he doesn't have any skills of even digging ditches or digging whatever it is. And he says, and I'm too ashamed to beg. He's come accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Imagine, somebody who is in Wall Street, if you will, and they're used to wearing nice suits and driving Lamborghinis and everything else, if you will. But then they lose that position, they're going to be too ashamed to beg, right? And so you kind of see where this guy's at. So he has this small window, and he says, I know what I'll do. I will make me a bunch of friends. I will make me some friends so that whenever I don't have a job, at least I'll have my friends. I'll have some friends. You with me? All right, so that's how he calls in. He says, I resolve what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, they may receive me in their households. See, he's doing some favors. Oh, I'm going to do some favors here so that somebody will do me a favor. So he called every one of his master's debtors. Now, we don't know how many there are. There could be a bunch. And he says to one of them, he says to the first, how much do you owe my master? And he says, 100 measures of oil. Now, these are commodities. These are not just money, but commodities that he has. And he says, well, then take that and write down 50. Now, immediately we think, what in the world? This guy just undercut his boss. It's like, okay, he's getting fired. It's almost like he's taking vengeance out on his boss. Doesn't it look that way? Kind of looks that way, doesn't it? It's like, oh, you're going to fire me? Well, I'll just take a few parting shots on my way out.
Pens and the pencils out of it.
All right. Then he says to the next one, how much do you owe? He says, 100 measures of wheat. And he says to him, take your bill and write 80. Man, this guy is just something else, isn't he? Well, there's a lot of different thoughts on this. All right. Notice, though, very important point in verse 8. So the master does what? Now, this guy, he's been wasting his goods, right? He's losing money because of this steward not taking care of business like he should, right? That's the picture. Let's now go to the master, the man of the house, the owner of all this stuff. He's been wasting his goods. So the fact that he's been wasting his goods, he's going to fire the guy. And then on the way out, what does he do? He takes away my profits, right? He's taking even more of my profits. I'm already losing money from this guy. And on his way out, he costs me more money. Is that how we typically see that if you do business? All right, that whenever you think about business, that's how this is working. But notice what the master says. It says does he deride him? Does he get on to him? Does he get upset with him? What is it? What's the word that's used there? He praised him. He commended him. All right, so what does that tell us? Here's an interesting thought. Here's an interesting thought. Go with me to Exodus chapter 22. All right, keep your finger here. Go with me to Exodus chapter 22. And look in verse 25. Somebody read that for me, please.
If you lend money to any of my people, which you who is poor, you shall not be like the money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him.
All right. There's other laws too that follow that same principle right there in Exodus. In Leviticus chapter 25, in Leviticus chapter 25, and Deuteronomy 15 and 23 all talk about how you shouldn't, as your own brother, you shouldn't charge them interest. And so some of the thought is that, well, perhaps this was him just taking out the interest. If he owed 100, maybe that was the 100 including interest. And so what he's doing is he's just taking that interest off of there and bringing it back down to what it would be without the interest. Now that's a thought. It's just a thought. It doesn't know, we don't know exactly what it is. But you think about, some of the systems that we have had in the world. Have you ever heard that song, I Sold My Soul to the Company Store? Y'all heard that song? You know what it's about, right? So you go get a job, and there's different jobs. In this case, the coal mine. But you got to have the clothes, and you got to have the lanterns, and you got to have the pickaxe. Well, you go to the general store, right? The company store, and get that stuff. Well, you don't have the money. You haven't got your paycheck. Well, that's all right. We'll give you a bill of credit. You go work, and, well, you need some food and stuff too. Next thing you know, your bill of credit is bigger than your paycheck. And so they come at the end of the week, you get your paycheck, you got to pay your bill at the credit store, at the company store, but now you need more food and stuff. So basically your credit bill keeps going like this, and your income never catches up to it. Have y'all familiar with those, heard of those, seen those? Hopefully you've not been involved in one of those. Well, that's that's another kind of thought you have. And so whatever it is this steward is doing, it could be legal. It may not be right, but it could be legal, what he's doing, because the master commended him for it. Now, be careful with the commending, because we're going to get into that a little bit more, what he means by that, and that's why I opened up by talking about Rahab. So the master, he's not condoning what he does, but how he did it. That's going to be the key thing. So he commended the unjust steward because he had why? Because why? Why did he commend him? What is that? What is dealing shrewdly?
Very skillful. Be crafty like a fox, meek like a lamb. If you're a good person, you can learn one thing. These guys are skillful. We should use skillfulness in all of our lives.
Oh, you're getting too far ahead of the lesson.
Is extremely skillful. A man of God should be so skillful.
Yeah, don't get too far ahead of the lesson. You're right on the money, brother. You're right on the money. All right. So he says that he commended him for being shrewdly, for dealing shrewdly. All right. Now, going right into what Jack was just saying, look at the very next verse, or the very next part, the second part of verse 8. This is what Jack was saying, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in their generation than the sons of light. That's what Jack was saying. They're very, very skillful, right, in what they do. Now, who's he talking to? Remember we gave you that the example of somebody in earshot? Who's in earshot? Pharisees. And what are they skillful at doing? Yeah, they kind of twist things and stuff to their advantage, right? So that's what he's saying here is look at what they've done. There's a wise move. It turns out to be a wise move for really both the steward and the master. Now, why would you say that? Well, the steward, obviously, because what has he gained whenever he no longer has a stewardship? He's got those friends now, right? Oh, buddy, man, you saved me a bunch of money because I wound up not having to give so much of my oil to him or so much of my wheat or whatever else, right? Hey, yeah, anything you need, boy, you save me, you help me out. I'll scratch your back. You scratch mine, I'll scratch yours. That's what that is, right? But what does that also do to the master? What kind of attitude are people going to have towards the master now? Good attitude, right? Hey, he didn't charge me that interest or whatever it was, whatever the reason was. He didn't charge me as much. Yes, JC? Yes, sir? Yeah, I believe it. All right, so here's where people get confused about this parable. All right, look at what Jesus says now in the verse 9. And I say to you, make friends for yourselves by unrighteous mammon, that when you fail, you may be received in everlasting habitations. Is Jesus using this bad person? I mean, this steward obviously is bad because he's getting fired. He failed at his stewardship. You follow that? He failed at his stewardship. Is Jesus, and then he gets fired, and then he goes and he undercuts his boss. So is Jesus using a bad person as a good example? Yeah. Why not? Right? Why not? Why not use this as even an enemy can be pleasantly surprised with the skill of an opponent? Jack, being in military, have you ever seen that where the opponent, you look at him, you're like, well, wow, that was quite impressive. Whenever somebody's coming at you, whenever you're fighting against somebody or you have an enemy or something, sometimes the opponent steps back and goes, okay, that was pretty impressive. Have you ever done that? Have you ever done that yourself? You see something, and here's typically what we say, well, that's not the way I would have done it. But does that make sense? All right. So that's what's happening here. And this is kind of the way that it's explained in my notes here. It's not kind of like parents. Parents use this logic as what Jesus is using here. So if that rotten Johnny down the street there can be nice to his kid sister, well, you can do it too. Isn't that kind of where you were going a second ago, Jack? So now go. No.
But let me go out on a limb here. I think there's this is I think, be careful, anybody says I think. I think that there's an underlying thing here. He's talking to the Pharisees.
Yes.
The Pharisees have been very skillful in one way for sure. Think about this. Jesus is the Messiah. He's done everything to prove he is the Messiah they've been looking for thousands of years, certainly 1,000 years. And think about, what if the Pharisees and the scribes were actually looking for the Messiah from the Bible? If they were good people, Jesus would have been able to overwhelm it. I mean, they would have accepted him. So they skillfully defeated many of the Jewish ears from seeing the Christ. So they used great skill in that, in the terms of history. Just think what they did. What if they didn't exist? Would Jesus have, common people understood he was the Messiah amongst the Jews. So I think part of this is he's painting the future. I've come to God, and look at the skillfulness these Pharisees have done to try to divert your attention from me being the Messiah.
Yeah.
That might be a stretch.
No, I think you're right on the money because of the next verses. When you get into verses 15 to 18, I think that kind of pulls that out. So let's build that on that a little bit more when we get to those verses. Just saying, were you able to hear what he was saying? That there's kind of an underlying thing going on, is that the Pharisees are acting shrewdly, skillfully in diverting the other Jewish ears from recognizing that Jesus is the Messiah. Did you pick up on that? I believe that is an underlying thing that's going on here. And again, we'll show that in these verses 15 through 18. So that's basically what this parable is about. People get confused when they see this parable because they think that, well, this is a bad guy. Why is he commending this guy for doing bad things? He's not commending what he did, it's how he did it. And here's the point, if an evil person can figure this out and deal shrewdly, make plans for the future, You see there's the lesson. If an evil person can make plans, dealing shrewdly, to make plans for the future, then sons of light should be able to do it just as well. That's the lesson. You need to be making plans now, and that's why he says that. Make friends for yourself with unrighteous mammon when you fail, you may receive you into everlasting habitations. Then he goes on, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much, and he who is unjust, what is least, is unjust in much. Listen, if you as a stock boy, all right, you as a stock boy at a grocery store are regularly pilfering, stealing, all right, what do you think that same person is going to do when they make it to be a CEO in that company? You see what's happening there? But what if that same little boy uses his allowance and saves it? He always saving, just always saving. What do you think he's going to do whenever he gets to be an adult? He's probably going to have a pretty healthy IRA or something, right?
You got that right.
You understand? Got that right. You understand the difference that God is saying and Jesus is saying, look, you can tell how a person is going to be. Not that somebody can't change, but you can typically tell if you're not faithful in little, like a stock boy versus a CEO, it's not going to change. You need to get your priorities right. You need to learn how to be a good steward, how to take care of things and use it properly. All right, so if that's the way you are when it comes to spiritual wealth, God can certainly tell how you will handle spiritual wealth if it's given to you. Think about the reward that you're going to get if you're faithful. Does that make sense? What did Jesus say? Revelation chapter 2, verse 10. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you crown of life. All right? A crown is significant. You don't get that for no reason. If you have a marathon, and there's 100 people running a marathon, they don't give everybody a crown. Right? They give one. And so you need to be faithful to the end to get that crown. And that's your reward. So God's going to give you that or give you more. This is the other thing, the health and wealth gospel. You've heard of that before, right? That as long as you go to church and you put your money in the plate and do all those things and give to the poor, well, you're going to be more successful. Listen, that's in the church. We had to deal with that down in Paraguay a lot. We had some that literally thought, as long as I'm a Christian and I do well, I'm going to do better in my business. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. Those two separate things. Don't mix the spiritual with the physical. So Jesus, once again, is commending this person, this bad person, for being shrewd, for dealing in a way to make friends, to look for the future. And that's the point trying to get across to us. Any more comments? Yes. Oscar? I would 100% agree with you. I think that's exactly what he's saying, because mammon is that physical aspect of it. Yeah, use this. That means that if you have money or resources or things like, use it. Use it for spiritual applications. What does it say in Matthew chapter 6? Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, right? Well, how do you do that? We're in the physical world, How do we do that? Doing good deeds. How's some more ways of laying up treasure in heaven? Doing good deeds is one answer. What's another way? Teaching the gospel. What's that? I heard some others. What's some other ways to lay up treasures in heaven? What? Living a Christian life, being faithful. What more? Maybe we need to have a lesson on how to lay up treasures in heaven. Help others. Visit the orphans and widows. Bring others to church. Yeah, we're popping good. Yes. You start to say something?
I have a question.
Okay.
There in verse 11, what Oscar said just made me think of this. Jesus calls it my ESV calls it unrighteous wealth. Other versions call it unrighteous mammon. Makes it sound like money itself is evil. As opposed to the other verse that says the love of money is the root of all evil.
Right.
Not that money is the root of all evil, but the love. But this makes it sound like, well, money's really evil anyway.
Well, let's stop and think about that. When he says unrighteous wealth or unrighteous mammon, it's not necessarily money, because wealth comes in other forms too, right? You can have wealth in more forms than just money, right? Yeah, how did you get that money? All right. So I think this also leads back to things like Romans chapter 12, verse 2, whenever it says that you are to transform your mind. You don't be conformed to this world, but be conformed to Scripture. So let's say that you were a CEO or something and you got your money from some not so good deeds or things like that, but then you become a Christian, you know. So that would be considered unrighteous mammon, right? But you could still use that to God's glory. You may have land. You may have property. You may have different things that are not good things. For example, I know, I mentioned that a minute ago about the health and wealth gospel. Well, there's a brother down in South America who has a convenience store, and he sells liquor. And he doesn't want to give that up because that's one of his biggest incomes. I wonder how that's classified. You see the dilemma there? Can he use that? I know that gets into some other questions, right?
Now, not to go too far afield here, but this also makes me wonder if he's calling this, if you just simply take unrighteous wealth and excise it from the rest of the verse in the context, is this an example of where some of the early Christians came up with the idea of the physical world is evil,
Yes,
spiritual world
absolutely.
is pure, therefore Jesus could not have been a physical man, else he would have been evil because nature itself was
Yep.
evil. He had to have been a phantom spirit.
Gnosticism. Yeah, Gnosticism. That's exactly where this comes from. People taking verses and getting confused and stuff like that. Don't lose the main point. Remember, a parable is what? A parable is using earthly objects to teach a heavenly concept. Please keep that in mind for next week when we get into the rich man and Lazarus. All right, so a parable is earthly objects to teach a heavenly concept. This is an earthly object teaching a heavenly concept of basically you have a short window of time. There's the lesson. You have a short window of time. Use what you have to lay up treasures in heaven. Get ready for the future. That's basically the whole lesson right there. That's what he's commended for. And how do we know that? And now I want to dig in deeper what Jack was saying earlier. Look in the next verses. Verse 14, the Pharisees picked up on this, right? They see it. Who were what? Lovers of money. There it is. They were that. There's your answer right there, what he's dealing with. And I think that goes back to what you were saying, Paul, the love of money, right? Lovers of money heard these things, they derided him. They were not happy about it, so they started making fun of him. So what does he do? Boy, he literally punches them in the gut right here. Watch what he says, verse 15 through 18. You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is highly esteemed among men is an abomination in the sight of God. The law and the prophets were until John. Since that time, the kingdom of God has been preached, and everyone is pressing into it. And it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced from her husband commits adultery. Then he goes into the rich man and Lazarus. I want to deal with these verses right here. We'll deal with the rich man and Lazarus next week. That's a whole other issue. But notice what he does. He says, he's talking about this steward who's not taking care of his business properly, right? He's going to lose that stewardship. Well, who has a stewardship right in the time of Jesus? The Pharisees, the scribes, right? They're the ones who are teaching the law. And that's why he says the law and the prophets was until John. In other words, your window is short. It's closing in, fellas. You got a short amount of time to get this right. Because what happens in AD 70? Actually, what happens in the day of Pentecost? The church starts, right, in just a few more months, right, from this point right here. But then it's for sure over by AD 70. So these guys, that's what he's talking about. You don't even get the law. Listen, they see you. They see what everybody sees you and thinks that you're righteous and that you're holy and everything else. But what does verse 15 say? God sees your heart. You're not fooling God. You remember, you go back to chapter 11, all the woe to the scribes and Pharisees. Woe, woe, woe. Remember all the things they were doing? What were they doing? They were tithing. What were they tithing? Little bitty pieces of leaves, right? Oh, this is my tithe. Meanwhile, they got, acres and acres and acres of fields out here, but we're going to tie these little leaves off these mints. You understand what I'm saying here? Keep that in mind when he talks about the law right here. And then he says in verse 17, it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one tittle of the law to fail. The law of God will not fail. All right? This whole world's going to go away, but God's word's always going to stay. And how do I know that? Now, with that in mind, look at verse 18. See, this kind of looks like it's out of place, doesn't it? Woo, boy, did he just take off on a left turn. That's what it looks like, right? He's sitting there talking about mammon and all this, and he's going to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. That's kind of weird, you think, but it's not. It all falls right in here because what's the problem? In that day and age, these Pharisees, these same men standing right there, they had twisted God's law so much that they literally would divorce their wives if they burned the bread. They would. There's historical record of this. If they burned their supper, they would divorce their wives. They got to the point where if they found a prettier girl that was prettier than their wife, they justified in their minds that they could divorce their wives and marry that woman. You see how they've twisted the law here? That's what's going on. And so Jesus is bringing this back. And there's a whole nother study that we're going to have when we get to Matthew 19:9. So don't worry, we're going to deal with this. But when he says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. You have twisted the law and you think that you're doing fine. You're not. You're an adulterer. All right? And not only that, but whoever marries her is divorced from her husband commits adultery. Now you made her commit adultery. You're twisting the law. You don't understand. You're trying to justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. Make sense? All right, so this is all has to do. Please, whenever you study this, study chapter 16, 1 through 18, because it's all connected there. He's all talking about the way the Pharisees are. Now, he's talking about what happens whenever, getting what money, this good steward is using your money to get to heaven. That's basically the lesson. Use your money, use your wealth, use these things of the world to get to heaven. That's kind of the point Oscar was making. When we get next week into the rich man and Lazarus, it's using your money unwisely and getting yourself to hell. That's basically chapter 16 in a nutshell. How to use your money. How to use your wealth. Let's put it that way. How to use your wealth. You can either use it to get you to heaven or you can use it to get you to hell. That's chapter 16 in a nutshell. All right?
You don't have to have wealth, though, but you use your esteem.
Well, wealth is relative, right?
Right.
Wealth is very relative. I feel like I am an extremely wealthy man. Because, and now, if you look at my checking account, you would laugh, okay? You would laugh. But that's right. Because why am I wealthy? Because I have, number one, I have salvation. All right? I am saved. That's the main thing. I've got an inheritance in heaven. Number two is I've got a wife that loves me and I love her. Number three, I've got a family. Number four, I've got my health, and these are not in any particular order at this point. Number five, I've got this church family. And I've got a lot. I've got a roof over my head. I've got a good paying job. I mean, what else do I need? I am very wealthy. Now, using that, with that wealth, I need to get myself to heaven. I need to use what I have to get to heaven. And I'm a steward. Therefore, even my wife, she's not my wife, I'm her husband. And I've got to get her to heaven. You know, I've got to help get you all to heaven. That's stewardship. Don't miss that point. All right. Great conversation. Thank you so much for your participation this morning. I hope this has been beneficial and help you understand more of Luke chapter 16. We will pick up next week with the rich man and Lazarus. It's going to be a very good study. Be sure and be here for that. And I want to give you a heads up. You might have seen in